Welcome to Show Studio's live panel discussions. As you all know by now, a panel of experts that we are surrounded by, this time virtually on a screen, are going to discuss and debate some of the recent shows. Today we are here to talk about Tom Ford's recent show. But before we get into it, let's let the panelists introduce themselves. I'm going to start with you, Osman.
Hi, I'm Osman Ahmed, and I am IT's Fashion Features Director.
And we're very impressed with your backdrop, which no doubt we will reference shortly. MC.
I'm MC Phil. I'm the fashion critic for Show Studio.
And Jill.
Linton, I'm the founder of Byronesque.
Welcome. So as you can see today, I'm going to be spinning around a lot. So I was joking earlier that I have never done any core exercises, which would have been quite useful now, but this could be my workout. Now, Mr. Tom Ford, I thought we'd just get straight into it. And actually, there are a lot of expectations with designers that we feel like we know, designers that have been working for a very long time, designers that have a very specific set in stone design language. In his note to the show, he talked about kind of glamour that's still chic, but more straightforward and somehow still casual. MC, I wanted to come to you because, of course, you sent in your live report yesterday from the show. And I guess from the sense of it, you felt there was a bit of hollowness around the show. Can you tell us a bit more what you thought about the collection itself?
Sure. And in terms of the direct catwalk presentation, it was quite enjoyable and quite succinct. I mean, you think of the elements of kind of Ford in terms of Gucci, Lexicon, and YSL. I think when he started, when he came back into women's wear, you saw a lot more of his YSL influence. And as over the last 5 years, things have become a bit more Guccified. And so with this one, you think about kind of the glimmer from that. The Ford mainline collection, I think it was fall 14 violet with the Jay-Z jersey dresses, the kind of shimmer from there. You think of Banks Walton's initial exit from the 2018 show, spring specifically. You also think of the sheen and the gloss from Mika Argañarez from that same collection. And you take that math, right? You then have an equation that's a little parts of the Subway show from spring 20, and also weirdly, the Gucci collection from 2004, where you kind of had like jogging and athletic interpretation. And so you take all that fabulousness with that athleisure, and you had this really explosively glamorous catwalk proposal that was at parts easy, at parts desirable, and just sexy as all hell.
What did the show feel like, particularly in the backdrop of the pandemic and everything people are expecting? And there's a lot of excitement, of course, around shows in real life. London Fashion Week starts unofficially tonight, but also more officially tomorrow. What was the feeling like inside the show space?
When the lights dropped, everyone got quite excited. And then when the first model exited, everyone kind of like hollered a little bit and howled a bit. And so there was a celebratory atmosphere in the air around the time of the show.
Yeah. What do you think they were celebrating?
Tom Ford tends to give you a feeling. You know, he tends to give you that like roll out the red carpet, Hollywood big movie feeling. And so maybe part of it was obligation, but another part of it was just everyone's happy to be back in the saddle again, you know?
Osman, I was interested in something you wrote in 2019 for ID. You said, Tom Ford is not one to be disheveled. Fashion's king of sex is always on point when it comes to formality. You cringing, even if he's in jeans. It's a good quote. What did you mean by that? And is that something that still, because particularly with this sense of this discussion around informality, this is Tom in some senses being relatively informal, but still using his own design language with that informality. Do you think that still stands up? Because the sex comes up a lot. People talk about sexiness when they talk about Tom. Do you think that was there?
The sex or the informality?
Both.
I think both were there. And I think that's what's been interesting to see over the last year and a half, the last 2 years. He's spoken a lot more about being casual, about being relaxed, about informality, which I think most people would look at a Tom Ford show like this one and would not see those things. It feels very high octane, explosive glamour, as MC put it. But then that said, maybe in Tom Ford's world, this is really casual. You know, he is someone that is so, you know, the image of him is burned into our memories. He always looks perfect. You kind of have an image of his lifestyle as well as his designs. And I think it's interesting to think about what he does during lockdown, you know, Tom Ford in tracksuits and staying at home and being a dad. It's really strange.
Do we actually know what Tom does during lockdown? Has he actually told anybody?
I think he said that he was kind of in tracksuits and jeans, which is hard to believe, but
But they were sequined.
They were sequined and they had numbers on them. Jill, it's interesting, Osman said something that I thought was really pertinent, because we say a lot in Tom Ford's world, in insert designer's world. I think we used to say that as a sort of pass to sort of, I guess, explain maybe some of the elements of the collection that we may, as fashion observers, may not understand. And it's always said in sort of reverence and respect for the customer, right? It's like, who the hell are we? We're not buying this stuff necessarily. So we sort of say that as a sort of footnote to say, we may not think this is critically or stylistically that exciting, but in Tom Ford's world, in this case, it is. What do you think about this idea of worlds? Because I would say it's everybody's world now. And I wondered what your kind of idea is, or what your thoughts are on this idea of almost a designer operating in a bubble. Is that possible anymore?
Yes, definitely. And I say that because obviously we specialize in designer vintage. So we bury ourselves in the past and try and bring it back as though you're seeing it for the first time. And I feel like, I think Tom Ford's, I mean, this isn't new information. He's the brand master. You know, he was the brand genius. And I think that actually the Tom Ford world, let's call it the Tom Ford brand, is actually even greater than Tom himself now. And so when he was dressing the people, from 95 onwards, I think he's still dressing that person. Possibly even literally, growing older with them as well. I thought this particular collection, I mean, there's clearly very obvious, cues back to, the velvet suit from 96. You can see a lot of the ruching from YSL in 2001. The silk shirt from 96 as well. So it's as though there definitely is a Tom Ford world, but I think that what's happening in the world of Gucci, as it is now, you sort of get two camps. You get the people who are the Tom Ford camp of Gucci, and they are perhaps still with him in the Tom Ford because that's the world they know. Tom Ford came to us through Gucci, and I don't think that his designs have changed so much so that the people who want to be in his world would go anywhere else, which is why I think that he's still dressing those people. I thought the collection was, yes, very glamorous. It felt like Studio, 54 to an extent, but I think because I buried myself so much in his Gucci world, I felt like he was revisiting so much of it, and it felt older and more mature than it did the very first time around.
And would you say that also the women have changed? Because the world has changed in a huge amount. And I'm interested again in designers kind of being very self-referential, which this collection of course is. There's lots of kind of nods to previous things that both MC and Jill have mentioned that Tom Ford has done before. But the world is different, isn't it? Is it okay? Is it enough to just sort of be looking back at your own archive and representing them to us? Do we deserve more as spectators, as customers, as critics, as people that want to engage with the world? Shouldn't we be pushing forward more?
I don't think anyone else is doing Tom Ford as he created his your world, his world, as you put it. No one was doing anything else. And let's remember, or let's not forget rather, that when he came into Gucci, no one was doing the sort of sex appeal that he did, whether it was casual sex or sex by appointment, or very formal sex. And so he's kind of held on to that. And I think that this collection that he's just put out, I don't see a dramatic difference.
Yeah.
I think he's been very consistent in his brand world because he's a brand genius.
Yeah. MC, what do you think about that? The idea of a designer sort of repeating themselves when a lot of the factors around them have changed quite dramatically. Is that acceptable?
Depends on the time and era that they kind of reference themselves. And as I was saying earlier, he's kind of used the last couple of years to kind of like tweak and update his signatures. The subway show from a year and a half ago just felt very awkward, very disconnected. And so he took the color scheme from there, but then integrated it into basketball jerseys, basically tank tops for girls. And then he also kind of bifurcated the trackie and made it into a capri. And so I think when you do those things, and he did this in 04 with Gucci's Spring 04 collection. And I think when you do tweak it and when you modernize it a bit, you can then add a new communication to your world that remains modern, even though your world is still quite Teutonic and isolated, because most people in the world probably can't spring for a $7,000, sequin trackie or leather trackie. So it's interesting kind of taking from the wider world to, communicate with his own audience who may not be aware of what's happening, who may be quite insular as well.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting that Gucci has come up a lot already in this panel. We've only been live for about 10 minutes, but this idea of him kind of, I guess, shifting, or he's never going to shift away from that. As Jill said, he's a brand genius. And a lot of the language that he started began there in our consciousness anyway. And I wondered, again, this idea of sex and Tom and let's say Gucci, because Gucci obviously just released this sort of Disney S&M video thing recently. So again, you have the brand that is, again, Alessandro Michele has been very, very open about his reverence for Tom's period. Lots of his original pieces are on display at the Gucci Museum in Florence. So it's not this, it's not being ignored, his heritage. But I guess, again, in Tom's notes, there was a kind of sense of him saying that he had noticed other people doing things that he had done before. And now he sort of wants to reclaim them again and put them out again. And I think that is interesting, again, in terms of your role, Jill, this kind of keeping things in circulation, keeping archival garments in circulation. Is there a sort of hunger for Tom's Gucci period that has been sustained, or is it in peaks and troughs? Do people always want it all the time, or is it having a moment?
It's definitely having a moment. And it's interesting. We get a lot of requests for things, and so we're constantly sourcing and looking for particular things. But there's very specific Tom Ford Gucci things that people are looking for. They all want the velvet suits. They all want the handcuffs. They all want the accoutrements of that sort of Gucci moment that he created. And obviously the gowns with all of the horse bit buckles and all that kind of stuff. Those go very quickly. The kimonos, they're very iconic, specific pieces. Anything around those items almost feel like basics. They almost feel like Tom Ford basics. So, people really want some hardware, but they want to go all out on the hardware. They're not interested in just the little thing with the hardware. Having said that, the lingerie, with the hardware, I mean, the prices are crazy. That's definitely peaked off. People aren't willing to pay those sorts of prices. That was definitely a sort of LA Hollywood moment that spiked that. Thank you, Kim. But I think that there's definitely two camps. There are people that are still his customer and they went with him to Tom Ford, the brand, and they don't want to let go of these pieces. They absolutely cherish them and they love them and they're incredibly loyal to him, which is what makes me think he's still dressing them. So people are very happy to see him repeat things. I mean, it's the same for every designer. Vivienne Westwood looks back at all of the things that people have been inspired by her for. It's just the nature of creativity. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that unless it's a direct copy.
Have you ever worn any of Tom Ford's work?
Yes, I have. I still do. I've got a few pieces. My favorite collection was Spring Summer 2001, which was way sexier than I ever pulled off myself. But I remember at the time I bought the white stilettos, and you couldn't get them anywhere. And I just remember calling around every single Gucci store in the world, because I was just determined, and I've still got them, and they're impossible to walk in, but you know they're incredible. And interestingly enough, when people do really like that collection an awful lot. But when you can offer the shoes and you can offer the full look, that's when people get particularly turned on. So to speak.
Yeah. Osman, what do you make of this, the Gucci hangover, if you like? The fact that every time Tom is talked about or discussed, his very influential period at Gucci, which we should say was also shaped very much by Karen Roitfeld and Mario Testino, it's still there. It's there on everybody's mood board. Perhaps it's also on the mood board of a generation of designers, perhaps in their mid to late 30s, who are working at different houses now. They're things that they would have seen when they were at a formative age. So I'm wondering kind of if this, what do we think about how this is affecting the sorts of things in circulation now, Osman?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. I think that, you know, the second-hand market is so important today, and it's never been easier to get a hold of that Tom Ford Gucci piece that you've always wanted, you know, the white stilettos or the red suit. I mean, it will be very expensive, but it's out there, and you can Google, you can buy it, it can be delivered to you anywhere in the world. And then there's another thing, which is that I suppose Gucci under Alessandro Michele has started reeditioning pieces like the red velvet suit that we're looking at here. And I guess it means that with these things in circulation, you know, Tom Ford has to kind of move the needle forward slightly, because, you know, if he remade that red velvet suit, it's not the same as if it wasn't around anywhere else and you could only get it from Tom Ford. You know, his work, his design aesthetic has already entered the kind of ether in fashion, and it's kind of, you know, it's public domain now for designers, for stylists, for photographers, which puts him in a really interesting place because he almost doesn't own it anymore. You know?
Yeah, so that idea of ownership, I think, is really significant. When it comes to fashion, it's something, there are very few laws, if any, to protect the design of a garment or a designer's work. And in terms of imagery, we're definitely seeing that a lot. A lot of the fashion imagery that we see sort of regurgitates certain periods. And again, I don't mean to sound so sort of, you know, I guess slightly snobbish about the repetition of some of these things, but I do worry that it's not really pushing, as Osman says, pushing the needle. Where did you think Tom Ford pushed the needle to with this collection, Osman?
I mean, I really liked the sense of color, but for me, the thing is, in a way, I think he completely pushed the needle forward, because he is a designer that has never been afraid of vulgarity. And I think that's incredible, because in a way, fashion has become so vulgar, and so many designers are interested in exploring sex in a really explicit way. And we see it in music, we see it in, you know, film, we see it in advertising. Kind of everything is really horny right now. But in my mind anyway, Tom Ford was perhaps the horniest designer when he was working at Gucci, and, you know, the campaigns were very sexually charged. I think that there is a kind of playful vulgarity here with the colors, the fact that they're so bright and so mismatched, and these big kind of Mr. T chains and, you know, gold jeans and sequin tops tied together at the navel. It's so wrong that it could be right. And I think that that is really interesting when you're looking at a fashion show, because increasingly things are very either bland or they're kind of very camp and covered in 1,000 feathers and layers of tulle. And it's very hard for designers to kind of get a reaction from an audience, whether it's kind of complete disgust or complete adoration. And I think he strikes that balance. Well, he treads the line between those two really, really well.
Do you think he's still horny?
I mean, I think it's less explicit. I think it's less horny in a kind of sexual way. It's almost more this kind of vague idea of sex in a very kind of superficial way, I suppose. I think what was interesting is that he's also a designer that, you know, often when we speak to designers, they will kind of lament the rise of Instagram and what it's done to fashion and what it's done to design. And he's a designer that kind of embraces it. He embraces the way that the world is changing, the way that we see clothes and the way that, you know, they're photographed. And I think he kind of knows that it's not even about actually having sex anymore. It's about being seen to be sexy. In the same way that I think, you know, someone who is in head-to-toe leather in a gown with Gucci handcuffs is probably not really having sex, but is dressing with an idea of sex. Feels really superficial.
Yeah.
Faithful, I suppose. And, you know, there's an irreverence there.
MC, I wanted to ask you, because Osman was talking about the colors, which Tom also notes in his show notes, that he enjoys the kind of clashing of these colors. That's something he really enjoys. He also references quite a famous quote from Diana Vreeland, which I thought was, you know, a bit of a first search on Google for a quote from Diana Vreeland. I thought it could have been a bit more interesting than the quote he chose. But anyway, he also said something that made me feel a bit sad about this collection, in the sense that it felt very cynical to me, because what he said is black doesn't photograph well, and so clothes need to be increasingly cartoon-like to have power on the tiny screens on our phones. And I wanted to ask you, MC, what you thought photogenic clothes look like. And are these photogenic clothes? And how do we feel about a designer like Tom Ford acknowledging something that a lot of people had acknowledged at least 5 years ago?
He kind of had to acknowledge it. He was quite resistant in acknowledging social media age when he came back, and then he just kind of gave up the ghost around 2012 and said, "Oh, screw it, I'll just do it again, and I'll do it better than everyone else." And so to that end, yeah, these clothes are quite photogenic. I mean, you have these really aggressive aquas, and then with the sequin fabrications and also the wax fabrication on the men's suiting. Yeah, these are perfect for your smartphone. They're perfect for a vertical screen. Absolutely, they completely are. And also just this idea of catering to the majority, which he has done. You know, he's relinquished that, but at the same time, as I said, he said, "I'll just do it better than everyone else." And so it's like, if we're going to be vulgar, if we're going to be horny now, I will give you the option of being horny by tying the shirting around your waist, or, you know, you can untie it and then button it up. And so it's not completely just like topless and nude. It's like, it's there if you want it. If you don't, untie it and button it. So there are these weird kind of minor provocations where he's like, all right, this is a little tawdry, but this will still land very well on the screen. So I think it was a good balance, but also a good balance, but hovering above that is his didacticism. I
love the word tawdry. Thank you for bringing it to the panel. It's not enough circulation. Jill, what do you think about that? Tom talking about needing to make clothes that pop. So in a sense, they're sharper and tougher for the screen. Do you find that is something that you have to think about with your work as well?
No. I mean, we probably to our detriment, and we probably should. I mean, I find it slightly disappointing that Tom is designing a collection for Instagram. I'm going to pretend that that's not real. I think
we can edit that bit out. It's fine.
Because it's interesting because I don't see this as a vulgar collection. I don't see it as being particularly sexy. It feels quite mature to me, and maybe that's because my frame of reference is so sort of buried in his past and the energy that was around the collections, particularly 2001, for example, at the time. And when he brought on Beyonce and the Hollywood world to do the collection, when it was a very private event, he's always doing the opposite of what's happening, right? So when he brought out when he made fashion sexy in 95, 96, when he started all of that, it didn't exist. When everyone was doing these all-out fashion shows, he went private and made it a very private. No one can use phones. And so now he's designing for Instagram. There's something there that doesn't connect for me. There's something about fashion. And when we talk about fashion history, we try not to be nostalgic, but we always look back at some of the shows and you literally are like, it must have been incredible to be there. And there was this, it was fabulous. There were many shows and collections that were just fabulous. And so I don't see vulgar, I see fabulous. It's like he's gone, we've all been in our caves for nearly 2 years now. Everybody's feeling, there's a freedom that we can all experience again. And, we're seeing it with a lot of emerging designers who feel like they've got a creative freedom that perhaps didn't exist 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago. And I think this is Tom's version of that. There's a sort of, slight, creative freedom that he's playing with. And, I think that part of fashion's responsibility is to, make people feel fabulous. If that's that, there's many designers that I wouldn't call fabulous. Balenciaga wouldn't fabulous. That's a different kind of design. But I think this truly is, his point about it's a lot, but is it enough? So I get that rather than the sort of vulgarity of it.
Well, I mean, the man who has a fragrance called Fucking Fabulous is obviously interested in fabulousness in all of its facets. MC, do you think this is fabulous?
I actually agree. Like, it's definitely more fabulous than vulgarity, which is why you asked me before. I said that there are tiny vulgarities here as options, but it's definitely a lot more buttoned up. And yeah, there were very fabulous parts, particularly the intro, the first intro looks, and then in the final exits. The menswear, I think Gill was saying about the maturity of Tom Ford. The menswear is definitely mature. Like, you think of the gold lurex look, where the boy was in the Henley with the leopard print trouser. There were echoes of that in kind of early 2000s Tom Ford, where maybe the shirt would have been completely sliced down to a V-neck down to the navel. Whereas now you just have the Henley unbuttoned. And then you had trench coats, which were like a very Christopher Bailey thing. And we all know Christopher Bailey came up under Tom Ford. And so Christopher Bailey was never vulgarity. Was never vulgar. And so you had these weird notions of maturity. But in terms of the fabulousness, yeah, 2/3 of it was quite fabulous.
And how American do you think this feels? Because obviously, we have the big opening of the show at the Met, which is about American fashion. Again, Tom in his notes talks very much about moving back from Europe to the States and there being a sort of change in his sensibility or just noticing that difference. And I think a lot of the reviews, most of them pretty tepid, were talking about American sportswear. What did you think, or what do you think about this collection with that in mind? How American does it feel?
That's a tough one because I generally don't lock into an American sensibility of dressing. It's more of an emotion. And so if I feel sad intrinsically, then it's probably American. And there were so many things around this collection, venue, audience outside, audience inside, that just made me feel sad. And so by that metric, it was an incredibly American collection.
When you say feel sad, what do you mean?
The people in the audience could not have given a damn about these clothes. They're Tom Ford sycophants. They're friends of Tom. you know, and so there was a real hollowness inside the venue as well as outside the venue, because you're taking from mass market, you're taking from youth, you're taking from all these areas to ply into kind of $7,000 and $8,000, you know, clothes that are really in a gilded cage. And it was just weird because it was as disconnected for the onlookers as it was for the audience inside, right? They're not going to wear these clothes. So why are we really having this? You could have just had a digital show. It was just, I don't know, it was, yeah, so.
Is that generally a criticism you have of lots of shows in general, or do you think that feels like something that is particularly pertinent to Tom Ford?
I just think it's particularly pertinent to this audience. There was a real feeling of pointlessness Sunday night at this show. And it's very funny. I mean, you know, we're talking about the Americanness of it all. I tend to dress a bit like kind of a rent boy. And so my thinking before the show was, well, I need to change. And if I'm going to go to a Tom Ford show and I do have my rent boy aesthetic, I might as well be a Belgian one. And so I changed into kind of proper for me clothes, which is a very American mindset to do. And so, you know, even then, I've been fortified before I even got there. And so I guess all of these semiotics and all these feelings, it's a very American feeling. So I guess the answer is yes.
But that, and again to Jill's point, that's like the power of the brand. You dress up for Tom. You don't go to a Tom Ford show in, you know, in anything. You want, what do you want? You want structure, you want sort of glamour, it's a really interesting notion. I totally agree with the negative aspects of feeling like you have to dress a certain way to be seen or to feel like you fit into a space. But yeah, I agree with Tom. I remember always going to the showroom in Milan during Fashion Week, and immediately your feet sink into this very thick, sexy mink colored carpet, and there's sort of, you know, really deep oud candles burning everywhere, and you suddenly I feel very, very, very British and squat and, you know, soft footed. So it's a very strange thing, but also maybe quite powerful. But I guess, you know, the Tom Ford look can be, it's very intimidating. It's an intimidating offering. Osman, what do you think about that, dressing up for Tom?
I mean, I can see why a lot of people feel they need to. I think it's a very, there's a lot of richness there, and anyone that I know that has ever kind of bought Tom Fords, or people that I know that buy it, are incredibly rich, and the people that you see wearing it in the wild are, you know, from Moscow and places like that, where it is, you know, it sells really well at Harrods, for example. So you can understand why it's definitely at the top tier of fashion, and it's not very accessible to a lot of people. But I think that's why I always like looking at the show, because I mean, you don't need to know those people. You perhaps don't need to buy these clothes, but there's enough ideas in there that you can take away and do it at home on a shoestring budget if you wanted to, you know.
What are you going to do? You're going to be knotting your shirts for London Fashion Week or Paris?
Absolutely.
Weather permitting. Jill, what do you think about this idea of dressing appropriately when you're encountering a particular designer? And I mean that more so philosophically, not just in real life. Of course, if you're going to the show, it's a different thing. But do you ever get that with the designers you buy or wear yourself?
Do you mean dressing for the designer?
Yeah, kind of if you were going into a certain space that is, let's say, owned by a certain designer, be that an event or be that a certain, you know, Osman mentioned Moscow as a city, for example, but there are certain sort of associations or hashtags that we sort of throw at these things. I think for me, what is interesting about Tom Ford is that what it identifies is maybe what we need runway shows to be about. And for me, I don't know whether we need runway shows to show luxury. Because for me, this isn't fashion necessarily. If we think of fashion as something that's pushing something forward, it's new, it's not necessarily young, but there are sort of new ideas. If this is about luxury, which is a wardrobe, it is about good quality things that people will buy and will wear and will cherish. Is this format of showing them correct? But yeah, Jill, I meant kind of more about, are there certain designers that you feel you need to dress differently for when coming into contact with them?
I mean, I can only speak personally, but no. I mean, I think it's a little bit like really great hairdressers have often got bad hair. Fashion don't, you know, if you're kind of, if you understand, if you're in the fashion business, you don't necessarily try hard, and hopefully there's a sort of creative integrity, and you just dress for yourself. So I don't subscribe. I mean, but then at the same time, you know, Tom would look great in a pair of jeans and a crisp white t-shirt. You can pull off a different kind of Tom Ford and a different kind of Tom for Gucci. But in terms of what you were saying about, did the show need to exist? Because let's not forget, he's selling a lot of fragrance and a lot of makeup. And that's also, it's, you know, it's a classic, isn't it? It's the same for many brands, but that's also why this show exists. Maybe we're going to see bright orange and bright blue eyeshadows. And, you know.
To your point, what you said earlier, though, about kind of the distaste of a catwalk show for Instagram purposes, that is the marketing folded into it all. That's the propaganda from the show. These clothes will sell to those Tom Ford clients. There were a few people there who actually would wear it, even if they're given it. But in terms of the Instagramification of it all, you needed the fabrications, you needed those loud colors, you needed those gilded Henleys and matching, you know, women's wear blazers to communicate to Instagram that, look, this is an exciting thing, isn't it? Because then they'll buy the fragrances.
But I think that's just so, it depends on who the customer is and what the brand's about. Because, you know, Rick Owens could still put out all black all the time, and the people who love Rick Owens would love that. So I think it depends on people's expectations and what it is they particularly love about a designer or a brand that they feel very emotionally connected with.
Completely, but the culture of Tom is propaganda. That's what he does better than almost anyone.
Yeah, the brand genius. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I think he kind of has to.
What is in the propaganda machine of Tom then? What do we think he's pushing?
Sex.
Glamour.
Come on, just shout out words. This is quite fun. Sex, glamour, what else? Around. But these are things that are sort of very contestable in the age that we're living in. You know, there's a generation of people engaged in fashion that want to almost in some ways disassociate fashion from the body in some ways. You know, obviously conversations around sex, around gender are also new, but obviously Tom comes from an era and represents an era almost that just has a very different kind of idea of these things. Now that's not a criticism, because there is space for obviously all of that, but I'm again interested in this relevance, or this struggle for relevance, to try and be to pop on Instagram. Not to say that Instagram has a certain customer that is only a certain age, but there is this kind of tension with trying to appeal to all these people at once in order to, as Gill says, to sell a lipstick or a perfume or all of those things. It's kind of rather an elaborate way of selling you these cosmetics in this day and age, isn't it?
I think that, I mean, we can talk about Instagram and we can talk about reality or the catwalk in a really abstract term. I will go out on a limb and say Tom Ford's customers probably buy most of their clothes via WhatsApp with personal shoppers, and they buy clothes to post on Instagram, whether that's at a private members club, at a wedding, amongst, you know, the super rich. These people exist. They're unafraid of social media. They want to be bombastic. And they're engaging with this brand on a really personal level, which is that it is loud, it's blingy, it's glamorous. It also has a very narrow idea of beauty and body standards, which is another conversation. But the point is, people really like that. People really want it, and they will go out and wear it. And, you know, we're talking about getting dressed up for places. There are still places in the world where you have to be dressed up in order to navigate them. And this really, you know, serves that demographic and those settings.
And Osman, how do you feel that changes your job or our job in passing or, analyzing and looking at a fashion collection? So the clothes themselves, how do we square that round peg when it comes to the things that you're saying, which is that this has a kind of consumer base that actually, isn't necessarily choosing to make purchases based off of what any of us are saying here or will go on to say. But in the larger kind of fabric or tapestry of the fashion industry and where it's headed, what do you think a collection like this says?
Well, I think it says that, our opinions are just opinions, and people talk a lot about inclusivity now, and that's something that they want from brands. But then that raises a really interesting question of, well, who are fashion shows for? If they're for everyone, then arguably it doesn't matter what people like us who work in fashion think. It really depends on what anyone who sees this show thinks and how they engage with it. But I also would say that Tom Ford is a designer that I don't think panders to the fashion establishment or, kind of critics like us. I don't think that he is someone that cares particularly about what critics write about him. I think he probably cares about what he wants to do with the show and who he's selling it to and the celebrities that he can dress and the models that are wearing it and the ambiance in that room, with that lighting, with the music and things. I think that's probably what he's considering. And everything else is just kind of, everyone's going to have an opinion about it. I think we're living in a world where, because of Instagram, people can see this show directly and they can either decide whether they like it, dislike it, whether they want to buy it, whether they want to unfollow. So it in a way it doesn't matter.
And just before we end on that really dystopian thought, Osman, Jill, I wanted to ask you, in terms of future archiving, were there any pieces in this show, any looks that you thought in the future people may be wanting?
Well, we do talk a lot about future vintage, and it's usually around something that's either going to be an investment, because collecting is a serious business nowadays, or just an emotional attachment to something. I think if you are a Tom Ford loyalist from Gucci, YSL or wherever, there's definitely some pieces that would be remiss not to be in the collection, whether it's the nod back to the velvet from 96, for example. But I being quite blunt, my answer is actually no. I think this is a collection that's just about now. I don't think Tom Ford's got anything to prove. I agree with Osman about that. He's just, this looks like a good time collection. And like I said before, it's fabulous in the extreme, and I do think that is a reaction to the life that we've all been living recently.
Yeah, let the good times roll. I'm turning more and more into my dad. Thank you all for joining. That was really wonderful. And thank you all for watching. Of course, there will be many more panels forthcoming, so do check social media. Do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Let us know what you think of what we've discussed. The conversation has only just begun, and we want to have it with you. So thanks for tuning in. Bye.